Alright, so this will be part 2 of the steps in the accident investigation process. Here are here's the last slide we left off on in part 1, talking about corrective action plans. So let's get into it. The next step in the initial accident investigation plan and process is to write the report. So as you're writing your report, what's important is to maintain a sense of narrative and storytelling. And that isn't to say, embellish or use hyperbole or different things like that. It's just be aware that humans process information better in a story structure, and you really are describing a series of events. So keep that in mind as you're kind of constructing the narrative in your outline. Also be aware of your audience, who's going to read it, what is the purpose of their analysis. If you can support that, that's better. You want to be aware of the tone and circumstances of your report, and understanding the goals of the overall investigation. And lastly, and this last bullet here might conflict, you might feel, with the storytelling bit, but it must reflect accuracy and not bias or politics. And keep in mind that this isn't necessarily politics in a national sense. This could be organizational politics as well. And the storytelling does not necessarily mean something is inaccurate. So going back, right, what is an accident? So an accident is the final event in an unplanned series of unique events that results in an injury or illness to an employee and may include property damage. It is the final result or effect of a number of surface and root causes. So as we look at this, these bolded items, right, we have event, unplanned, illness and injury, and employee. And we'll break those down in more detail. So what is an event? An event is comprised of an actor performing an action. That is the most common and basic aspect. And keep in mind, when we use actor here, we're not trying to anthropomorphize. An actor could be a component that takes an automated action. So just be aware of that. What about unplanned? So as we've discussed before, unintentionality is necessary for an accident. There's no such thing as a planned accident. Injury or illness matters. Why? So this is where we get into impact. Note that previous definition also, kind of as an afterthought, lumps in property damage as well. And hopefully the events or accidents that you may one day investigate, especially from a human performance perspective, only incur property damage, right? It's really kind of unfortunate when it involves injury or illness, but we need to be aware that impact matters. And sometimes you'll hear people use the old adage, no harm, no foul, right? But just because no harm ensued doesn't mean there was not a foul, doesn't mean there isn't room to improve, or if the harm was mitigated in some way. It's important to recognize those successes, but also note any deficiencies or the potential deficiencies that could have happened. This is also incredibly important if you're looking at instances of single point failures. And then it specifically calls out employee. And this is because it's important to keep in mind and to not lose sight of the fact that there's an impact to someone or something that actually matters and is worth our attention. And it's important, right? It's a tricky needle to thread where we want to be unbiased, just the facts, but we also don't want to lose sight of the real impact of this incident. So those are just certain aspects to kind of keep in mind. Now, sometimes this is the second or third time that I've called out, weird naming, nitpicking, and stuff. Sometimes you'll see this distinction where accidents it's not an accident, it's an incident because it didn't involve injury. Um, that's okay if that's the particular verbiage, or if that's the common distinction in your field. Uh, but just be aware that as we just discussed, right, that's probably somewhat of a unnecessary distinction, um, but it might be something you run into. So now looking at types of accidents, we have injury and illness. We talked about those. Damage. This can be property damage. This could be reputational damage, economic damage, um, failures. So was there just a failure of a process, and maybe luckily it didn't result in any of the previous three, but there was still something noteworthy here. And what are some other examples of accidents that we consider, and what are those characteristics? And that's an important thing to really kind of reflect on, especially as you start to untangle the knot of an accident, is to understand, what the characteristics of an incident is and or are, and where they manifest. So like we've discussed, intentionality, and we'll cover that a little bit more here too, but that's one of those aspects that often people don't consider. And then what happens is they end up determining, oh, it was a root cause because of human action or something. And be aware, right, of your relevant regulators or regulations. So, be aware what jurisdiction you're in and adhere to those general guidelines whenever possible. If you're specifically in one of these areas, or if there are, sometimes you'll see certain industries will adopt the principles of another adjacent organization or things like that. So just be aware of whatever that is and try to adhere as best possible to those requirements or expectations. And looking at why do we have regulations? So there is a term or an adage that'll go around sometimes, as saying that all regulations are written in blood. Now that's a dramatic characterization. It may not be precisely accurate in some instances, but warning labels, cautionary warnings, messages, and regulations surrounding those are typically there because somebody got hurt. Some incident occurred and there was some relevant harm. So then we ask, right, why do we regulate safety? Why is it deemed an important societal function that some impartial arbiter, whether that's the government or an agency or an industry group or something like that? And there's capitalistic reasons for it, right? You hurt customers, don't spend as much money on your products. But it does tend to be a fundamental role of government, as government seems to have manifested as this sometimes, hopefully often, independent and kind of middle stage for some of these entities. It's an important aspect to consider for that. We also deem others' well-being as important, and this could be descendant from a sense of morals, or even, and also the kind of golden rule aspect, right? We would like other people to be aware of and mindful of our safety if we're in such an instance. So that's another reason that we kind of keep that in mind. And then sometimes you'll hear folks say, are we entitled to safety? At what point are we being paternalistic, or some of those aspects? And those are kind of individual questions. I'd say that our current, at least in the United States, our current safety posture tends to be fairly protective. There's very few things in our homes or out in our daily lives that don't have some kind of a warning or safety expectations. So I would say it's kind of baked in to our culture, but that's still something that might be valuable to reflect on. All right, so okay. Oh, sorry about that. Back to intentionality. So, and this is especially important when we consider the human performance aspect, right? Like we talked about last week, the the performance of our memory and the way our memory functions, especially with things that we didn't see or aspects that we may not recall, how it kind of fills in those gaps. Um, if you commit an unintentional act and then after the fact realize, oh, I did that because of XYZ, you're often wrong. Um, so that's important to be aware of when you're investigating some of these human performance incidences, because people aren't the nature of what an unintentional act is. They're not aware of the consequences of their action in the moment. It begs the question, right, of were in hindsight, are they able to access that, put themselves in that position again, and come to some conclusion that's accurate, or are they relying on memory that could have been partially fabricated, or some of those aspects? So, um, and you'll get also people ask, right? They'll say, "Oh no, this wasn't an accident. People have known about this for years. It was negligence," or right. Well, we'll let the lawyers sort all that out, but if we look at accidents as a result of tolerating or ignoring an unsafe condition, right, is that unintentional? And that also may make sense to consider, right? When do the impacts from our actions begin and end? Uh, when we think about tolerating or ignoring an unsafe condition, right, there could be a lot of reasons for why those things persist. But often, especially in the safety domains and the resilience and reliability space, we consider that once you start tolerating such an unsafe condition, you've actually already started to have an impact on the organization, and often in ways you cannot see or touch. So the point of all this, it might seem kind of vaguely philosophical, but is that the context of the accident matters, and sometimes it can matter more than the root cause. So it's important to be aware, right? You are investigating incidents involving people that are imperfect but highly capable and resilient decision makers with a faulty memory system. And so there's a lot of things to untangle here, and being able to take a step back and kind of consider all these aspects is incredibly relevant. And causation. So when we say X caused Y, what are we actually saying? And again, we don't need to get into metaphysical notions of causation here, but it's important to realize, right, cause gets confused with blame very often, if not by default, in a lot of these incidents that we're looking at. Common sense is not a real thing in any coherent definition, and even aspects of knowledge that may be kind of common and tribal and ingrained in us from an early age are often very situational, regional, and tribal. They're specifically, there might be a rule that you follow that is a rule in your household and nowhere else. And it's one of those things where you don't know what you don't know, so you might go out into the world expecting everybody to do that. But nobody else has that rule, maybe because nobody experienced an incident that triggered the rule, or whatever else. So throw that out, right? Any assumptions you might have or immediate conclusions about an action, well, that doesn't make any sense, or common sense would say don't do that. Stop that. Don't do any of that. That's not helpful, and it's not factual. So looking at traditional causation, so this would be sometimes you'll hear it traditional, modern as the breakdown. Sometimes you'll hear safety 1, safety 2. But if we look at the older kind of paradigms of causation, There was a focus on the worker, very rarely on organizational or broader contextual factors. And the machines were never at fault. It was the assumption that a machine can't fail. You know, a hammer uh, can't strike your thumb on its own. Um, and that tends to be true when you look at more basic or simple machinery. And this could be one of those things that broke down once we got computers put in everything. And so we started to see a level of dynamic performance across these areas that we hadn't seen prior. And remember, we've talked about this before, systems causation, right? The idea of systems causation is that everything serves a role in the system. So what are the characteristics of such a system? And those are going to be critical aspects that we need to kind of untangle in human performance investigation, right? There's many factors or variables, a lot of interdependencies, and causal factors can manifest in many different places. So it's important to realize, right? Like, okay, why did something happen? And you know, these images here are two examples of bad feedback, right? Where we look at, okay, well, if humans are supposed to be out here taking cues from their environment, and we have these modern system structures or software or anything where their feedback systems are poorly designed, um, you know, that's not effective, right? So that's one of those things that we might look at and say, okay, yes, the person did the wrong thing, but they were responding to a feedback from the environment that was insufficient for the task or something along those lines. You may run into that. And we're always looking at fixing the system and not blaming within systems causation framework. It's a very kind of forward thinking approach of let's not worry about pointing fingers and understanding, you know, or you know, hauling people in to see why they made these poor decisions that led to this latent condition 10 years ago. Um, while that can be valuable, especially if you end up with an extent of condition, an extent of cause, or some situation where you have this repeating incident structure, okay, then we really have to dig in and find what is going on. Um, and if you remember our resident pathogen human error theory, the higher up in the organization or hierarchy that somebody is, the more and more frequently that they generate pathogens. So those are really critical to be aware of. But when we look at system causation, right, we need to understand the situation and find the root causes. So I love this image of the clean server cabling, right? Is you know, even if you just have a drawer that has various cables in it, it's always been one of those interesting things ever since I was a kid of I haven't touched this drawer in 6 months. How did everything get tangled, right? And that's our role, is we have to figure out how to untangle that without damaging anything, and then understand the root causes, which would be understanding where the cable should go and where it should kind of terminate from. So when we look at corrective actions, they should serve to repair the system flaws and design a solution which will prevent another occurrence. Now that's a reframing of some of the definitions we've talked about with corrective actions. You know, we say a root cause is the necessary piece for an accident, and that's true, but keep in mind as we try to drill down, and you'll hear people say, oh, you should only have one root cause. That's technically true from a causal perspective, but it's important to be aware that your corrective action plan should holistically explore the situation and repair the system flaws and try to design a context that will also prevent another occurrence. Because if you have a root cause, but the root cause was enabled or impacted or in some way made more likely by contextual factors, Not solving those is just kicking that can down the road until you get another incident that's similar. So we've been through this before. I bring it back in just to kind of give you a second, so feel free to pause this, reread through these if you're unsure of what we mean when we use these terms, because these will be very common in the parlance of kind of the following rest of the course. So, okay, so steps in investigation process. So we talked about the initial steps of an accident investigation. There were 6 or 7 of those. This is a more in-depth one that can be valuable. It is the OSHA kind of investigation process. So you'll have a lot of organizations might follow this, whether they're direct OSHA type. When I think OSHA, I tend to think, construction or different kinds of physical tasks that are relevant. Where like NIOSH tends to be, when we're looking at like office issues, right? We tend to land in NIOSH space more often than we do OSHA, but they could all be relevant. So this is just an example here, and take a look through this and try to think back to like, okay, how does this differ? It really doesn't. It just has more depth and more defined aspects. So like step 1, for example, you have to gather the necessary people and obtain the investigation kit. We talked about this prior, where you may have your own investigation kit depending on your context or your industry, but there also may be a prescribed investigation kit that you're supposed to use. Sometimes I liken this to in a police procedural show where they have the little baggies for evidence, right? And they're writing on them in specific boxes. Those are standardized processes that you may need to adhere to. So being aware of that is very relevant. And going back right, here's the more common process that's maybe a little bit simpler, but it is still valuable to bounce back and forth between them and understand, okay, if I'm just operating off of this model, am I missing anything? And that's where you might, eventually determine your own process that fits for the uses that you're commonly finding yourselves in. And, when we're looking at different application spaces, be aware of all of the relevant aspects. And when we talk about, I didn't include this bullet in here, I should have, but when we talk about communicating, right, and telling the story, these are 2 fantastic headlines. If you really want to see clever and interesting ways to tell stories, as well as very bad ways to tell stories, I recommend looking at local news sources. That is where, because they're under the greatest pressure of space and attention and things compared to like national media, you'll see a lot of hilarious but also very interesting ways of framing things, as well as incorrect, biased, unethical ways of framing things. But I guess this is likened in mainstream media in like the chyrons that run across the bottom of the screen, right? Every so often you'll see one of those that goes around that's kind of funny. But I always love this, right? The county has to pay $250,000 to advertise their lack of funds. And then the fish need water, the feds say, right? These are just, they're funny. They're intended to be like, this is silly. But I mean, obviously we don't know the rest of the picture, the history of these articles or anything. But either way, these can be really useful rhetorical strategies when you're writing and communicating within your application space. And we talked about this a little bit before, but I like to restate it here, right, as we look at the steps in an accident investigation. When we're looking at accident investigations, especially in human performance, you're going to kind of by default look for areas of fragility, areas not just where the causes that are present in your incident, but you will begin to see other causes or sources of fragility that may be tertiary to your particular accident, but are still relevant, and they'll start to catch your eye, and you'll start to see the overall fragility of certain systems. And so when we look at the opposite, when we look at resilience, right, what does that even mean, right? So sometimes when you look up resilience, you'll see examples of Sisyphus, pushing the boulder up the mountain endlessly, regardless of what stands in their way or goes through that. Where resilience really in our modern kind of usage ends up being more related to the ability of a system or process or person to bounce back or continue operating at a high level, even in the face of adversity or challenges. So, and you will see that fragility or fragile organizations or processes are kind of definitionally not resilient. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as we go through this, right? It's important to recognize whether it ends up in your report or not, but as you're discussing with individuals and you're trying to seek out both aspects of this incident, but also aspects that could contribute to others, you're trying to seek out areas of fragility, and sometimes you will find those by using fragility and resilience as mirrors. So if you find fragility, ask questions about the opposite. Like, are there areas of resilience here? Is this something that is considered from an organizational perspective? And vice versa. Maybe you find some really great evidence of resilience, so then you might ask the opposite. Okay, what would this look like? What would this look like in a fragile sense within this context? And here's just some examples about fragility and resilience, right? We have the Texas ERCOT grid, the power grid that a few years ago had a lot of problems where it was shown to be incredibly fragile with temperature and weather events that it wasn't kind of planned for as we've started to see different changes in climate. Similarly with California's rolling blackouts, right? One of the solutions to the wildfire problems was to randomly black out the power system. And I remember when I first saw this news article, I was very confused. Because to me, if you turn out the lights, people might light candles or whatever. Like fire becomes more prevalent, I would think. But then after some investigation, right, I found out, okay, the reason they're doing that is because their power infrastructure, the power lines themselves, are very poorly maintained and prone to issues where they're sparking and different things like that. Which then blew my mind that, hold on, an entire state, a large, significantly large state, California has the GDP, it was, if you break it out of the United States and just consider it independently, it becomes like the 5th most economically powerful country in the world. And meanwhile, they just kind of didn't maintain stuff for 20 years. And then you have nuclear, on the far opposite side, right? We have nuclear power safety systems that are, some people will argue, too resilient. They're resilient in a way that's like inefficient and costs money, and it's not a value add. And so it's important to kind of look at that and understand in your context, where are the nodes of fragility and resilience. And lastly, we ask, right, are all accidents a sign of some fragility? And typically I would say yeah, except for, if it's if a meteor strikes your plant, okay, I don't know how you could have been resilient in that sense, in a way of like designing for it. Now your response could have demonstrated resilience if you've got really capable staff that responded appropriately or in some heroic way and maintains continuity of operation. But typically all accidents are a sign of some fragility. And keep in mind, the accident is not the cause here, it's just a symptom. So that's important to be aware of. And looking at the symptom stuff, here's a different graphic, but we've talked about this before, the Swiss cheese model of uh, respiratory pandemics, right? This was pretty popular during COVID, but I like it because it is a very capable uh, model to show why all of those different approaches to stopping the spread of COVID were necessary. And I don't think anybody was necessarily using the Swiss cheese model to determine what those were, but that is what all those layers were intended to do. So, in this analogy, right, infection would be an example of these barriers failing. It's an example of an accident, right? An accident is the result of something passing through all of the holes, and you get to an impact or an event. Now, keep in mind when we've talked about like accidents being injury, illness, property damage, right? That's if they get all the way through. When we look at like failures or when you see an incident arise, this might be not be an accident, but could be a condition raised by staff or anything. That could be that we're seeing a lot of instances of stuff getting through some of the holes in a consistent way or persistent way, and that is also valuable to investigate there, especially with humans, right? We often I look at these models and I say, okay, this is strong, but from a human factors type style, right? Our job is to design the layers. We determine where the holes are, try to keep them away from every other hole as far as possible, right? Within this limited canvas of space. Well, when we're looking at like human performance or even human reliability, right, I often say, okay, now if we flip this in like a modeling sense, what if you put a skewer through the center of all of the barriers and started spinning them at varying rates of speed? Because that's the reality of human performance, is the barriers are constantly shifting in the sense of how humans interact within, around, or with those barriers. So it makes it that much more difficult, right? So your role in a human performance investigation is to understand not just what were the barriers, what were the flaws in those barriers, but also what were the state of the barriers at the time of the incident. Because some of these, I mean, you could have some instances where you have mechanical failure. So let's say we had this ventilation or outdoor air filtration was down for whatever, a mechanical failure. But we could also, I like this one where it's, if it's crowded, limit your time in the space. Okay, well, what's crowded mean? Right? Do the holes then expand based on the level of, or the count of people in a space? How do we understand that, right? And those are all aspects to keep in mind, and think about those as you look at like an accident you might be looking at or working in, is just, okay, what does this look like in the moment? And how do we support humans to do this action successfully and try to combat the realities of that dynamic nature as much as we can? All right, and that is the end of part 2. Thanks.